This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Welcome back. We have actually a great session in store for you, which I'm sure will inform the previous discussions that we already had on theatre reviewing. We have two fantastic guests, two excellent theatre critics, Andrew Dickson and Mark Fisher. Andrew Dickson is a writer and critic writing mainly for The Guardian and The New Statesman. A new edition of his rough guide to Shakespeare came out in 2009. He has contributed to the New Cambridge Companion to Shakespeare 2010, and he appears regularly as a critic for the BBC. He's also an honorary fellow in the English department of Birkbeck College, University of London, and is currently a visiting fellow at Warwick University. Very busy. He is writing a new book on global Shakespeares for Bodley Head, Random House UK, and Holt Macmillan US, and is blogging about his journeys at worldselsewhere.com. Mark is a Scottish theatre critic for The Guardian and Variety, a former editor of the List magazine, and a frequent contributor to The Scotsman and other publications. He's the author of the Edinburgh Fringe Survival Guide, How to Make Your Show a Success, Methuen Drama 2012, and the forthcoming How to Write About Theatre, Methuen Drama 2015. As a judge, he is on the panels for the Theatre Awards UK, the Scotsman Fringe First Awards, and the Critics Awards for Theatre in Scotland. He is also an advisor for the Carl Tamber Best of Edinburgh Award. I'm terribly excited to have our two guests. We will have a discussion entitled Reviewing in a Global Context. But I thought that I would just say a few things that came to my mind after the previous panel, because I had a sort of a déjà vu moment while reading Sal's paper and hearing the other papers, and especially that I know I met Catherine Love, who presented the paper, and Mark Fisher at Critics Circle celebrations of the 100-year anniversary. Just a year ago, a bit more. And the déjà vu moment is because there were exactly the same issues raised more than a year ago amongst critics, and the same kind of anxiety expressed when it came to discussing methodology, professional boundaries, generational gap as well. We had Catherine sitting in the auditorium and Mark obviously on the panel, but at the same time a dialogue going on between the auditorium and the panels about sort of the state of English, British reviewing, which was fascinating. I wonder, because both of our speakers today, our guests, are writing two books about, reviewing theatre, whether they will be able to alleviate our anxieties, which we all feel. So we thought we would start actually with Mark and Andrew telling us more about their two projects, and then we'll just continue to converse and obviously engage with the previous points that were already raised. Yeah, it depends whether you prefer to project or...
Should we just project?
Is it me first?
Yeah, you could be first.
Okay. So thank you. My book, yes, is called How to Write About Theatre, and it's due to be published by Methuen Drama next year at some point. And I guess I was, at a certain point, I was thinking it would be interesting to write a history of theatre reviewing, because there's a lot of anthologies of criticism published. There's a lot of, at certain points in the past, most major critics have written some kind of book, whether it's an anthology of their writing or an overview of theatre at the time or whatever. And but I then I got to thinking, well, that would be lovely for me to write, but would anybody actually be interested in reading it? And maybe, having done one book, which is a very practical guide to how to put a show on Fringe, Edinburgh Fringe, I was trying to think along practical lines of who's going to read this book, and I thought, well, if it was called How to Write About Theatre, it might suggest that I had some answers to give to the world. So I'm writing specifically about journalistic theatre criticism, which pretty much takes us back to really the early 1800s, maybe the late 1700s, but the context of it is to write about how any of us might write about theatre in a journalistic, internet-y sort of way, not in an academic way today. But many of the questions that were just being raised in the last session are very much relevant because the boundary between being an entertainer on the one hand, which Dorothy Parker would be, and a profound, weighty academic, as our German colleagues apparently are. There's quite a big, there's a huge territory there, and the more I think about it, the more I'm getting towards my deadline for actually submitting the book to Metro, the more I'm thinking how ill-equipped I have been over whatever 20 odd years writing about theatre, because I've got a degree in drama, but I don't have any journalistic qualification, and I've never been taught in the art or craft of theatre criticism. So it's it feels like I'm teaching myself by delving back into all of this material and asking many of the same sort of questions that maybe we'll ask now and that we have been asking this afternoon. So I think that's where I am.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here. I guess where I am is that my book, I suppose, kind of covers the sort of Shakespearean angle of this session, in that I have been, about the past 3 or so years, working on a book project around different kinds of global Shakespeare, so a sort of journey, a series of journeys that I've made through different countries where Shakespeare's work has ended up as being translated and transformed and ruined and made wonderful and just changed beyond recognition in some ways. And I suppose part of the reason I wanted to write it was that some of the things, again, we've been talking about, Catherine was talking about it very well, that sort of very kind of British approach to Shakespeare that we have here, the kind of primacy of the text and the primacy of a certain kind of way of thinking about Shakespeare, doing Shakespeare. And I suppose also it was instigated by the World Shakespeare Festival and shows I saw there that made me very conscious as a critic of my limited vocabulary sometimes talking about this kind of work. Not just because it's geographically different, though that's part of it, I suppose also because, particularly in the globe-to-globe aspect of the World Shakespeare Festival, as many of you will have seen, I guess, if you were there, the language operated very differently because each play was translated into a separate language, and there were no surtitles, very, very bare surtitles. So a certain percentage of the audience, which of course varied between the shows, had either no linguistic link whatsoever with what was being performed in front of them, or a kind of limited linguistic link. Maybe they knew a little bit of Hindi from their parents or from their grandparents, but didn't really speak it themselves. Maybe they understood, but don't communicate it. And I thought this was a really fascinating set of issues and questions. And I suppose in a way, coming back to this word anxiety, which of course dogs critics relentlessly, I suppose it occurred to me most when I was reviewing for The Guardian the opening show of that festival, which was a performance of Troilus and Cressida done by a company from New Zealand, done in sort of a quote traditional sort of Maori setup. That was a kind of, as described, the kind of version of it. And I wrote, as Mark will be able to understand, wrote my review in a taxi on the way back because it had to be in that night's newspaper, so I had the show finished, I think, an hour, 10 minutes late, so I had to write my review in 48 minutes, I remember. And then it went straight into the newspaper, went straight up online, whereupon I had the sort of fascinating, and these days I find it fascinating rather than dispiriting, because being torn apart in the comment thread for my supposed cultural prejudices, which were around how I described precisely what I was seeing in front of me, how I interpreted this in terms of what a haka war dance might be or might not be, what a traditional form of that might be or not be, what the language might be or not be. And of course, a lot of this was just kind of Guardian comment thread madness, which I'm sure all of us are acquainted with. But also I thought it raised really interesting questions about precisely how to describe this show, describe this cultural event. Why should I be doing it rather than someone who spoke the language? Why, I suppose, as a kind of white British English graduate who went to Cambridge, like a lot of a certain generation of critics, why am I here? Why am I sat doing this job? Why am I sat here in this taxi? So I suppose in some ways I'm trying to think about some of these things as I've been travelling around and seeing different kinds of Shakespeare in different sorts of places. And I suppose it's made me aware of a very, very obvious thing, which is, yes, one about the limited discourse around Shakespeare that often happens in this country, but also I suppose about transformability of Shakespeare and difference and similarity, which I guess when we're talking about criticism and about reviewing shows, when you're trying to do this complex nexus of different things, present, someone mentioned the word objectivity earlier, try and be objective but also be subjective at the same time, try and be canonical but also journalistic, try and be providing reportage but also trying to step back and provide context, all of these different things, and then you move it into a different linguistic context or a different cultural context. What does that mean? So yeah, it's been a sort of fascinating journey, and I'm in the process of writing at the moment, so it's making my head hurt. But it has, I hope, made me think more deeply about some of these questions than I would have done otherwise. Yes, that's where I am.
I was wondering about something because I have sort of two hats as an academic, and I dabble in theatre reviewing from time to time, and I found that the pressures of non-scientific reviewing are much bigger actually, and I wonder why my anxiety is much bigger when it comes to reviewing and just writing in 600 words or 300 words. And much less when I had 3,000. And I think it's more to do with sort of a market value, or value and evaluating in the sort of a sort of more public sphere. There was a mention of star rating and things like that. At one of the discussions at the Critics Circle conference, there was a producer, and she said, please do write shorter sentences so we can quote them and put them on posters. They want words like electrifying, and those get quoted. But if you, I'm never able to write like that, and I wonder how you manage it and how you manage the pressure to value.
Well, I think there's an interesting question. If you find that hard, I do find that fascinating. But I wonder whether one reason you might find journalistic reviewing harder is some of the things you've been saying, but also that you're exposing yourself in a much more emotional way. You're really committing yourself to saying, an academic essay, you were just saying this just in the break, you can write your 3,000 words or 5,000 words without ever saying whether the show was enjoyable or not. You just focus on the themes, you focus on the issues that it raised, but your personal, and even the language that you will use, and I'm using the word you, even the language that one will use, even the language that the present author will use, becomes very distant and objective and distant, whereas, I'm sure there are exceptions, I'm being heckled already, this is good. Whereas and I think theatre reviewing now sort of fits in this sort of, I'm going to mention Dorothy Parker again because I have just started as a great, bizarrely first time Dorothy Parker's theatre reviews have been anthologized in a sort of complete way. So I've just been reading some of her writing, but she's very quick to use the word I didn't think this was much good, maybe you'll think different. She's always using phrases like that. But journalistic writing is this odd mixture of that very old, of that older form of which I think dates back to the days when theatre reviewing was, in fact all the journalism was anonymous, so there was no writer credited. So as soon as you express an opinion, then and if there's no name attributed to it, the reader is naturally going to say, well, whose opinion is this? And it raises an interesting question. So it was only once the new journalism came around, Bernard Shaw, all the rest of it, and the character of the reviewer became a significant feature of the review, that I even became possible. So what I'm saying is that if you acknowledge the I in the review, however you disguise it, whether you say we find ourselves in the theatre, or you find yourselves in the theatre, or I find myself in the theatre, I think you're talking about I. And if you're going to go on the line, particularly if you've got 45 minutes in a taxi to commit yourself, that's a bit like going naked in public, because you might have got it all wrong, you might look absolutely ridiculous, and you might have, everybody else might have thought the show was terrible and you thought it was fantastic. So there's an element of, and your readership could be quite big as well, so there could be quite a lot of people lashing at you. So I wonder whether that's one of the sort of pressures, as well as all the millions of different things, reasons you might be writing it in the first place, reasons that you might be reading it in the first place, and the multiplicity of stuff that you might be writing about, from the stuff that Andrew's talking about, what this means on a cultural global level, to what it means in this theatre now, to whether the acting was any good. So there's an awful lot to do, and you've got 300 words and 45 minutes in a taxi to do it now.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to hear that. I guess one thing it's worth saying, I sort of wanted to shout out before when talk about star ratings, is that critics hate star ratings too. I mean, every single, I used to be the commissioning theatre editor at The Guardian, and before that was a commissioning online arts editor. Every single meeting of the critics, which we used to call moanathons actually on the desk, sorry, we never moaned, but certain critics did a lot of moaning. So at some point someone would go, oh, and by the way, star ratings, because they hate them. They hate them, and I indeed hate them when I have to give them. I think they're blunt and they're sort of dreadful. At the same time, I suppose, and maybe having had experience as commissioning on an arts desk gives me this perspective, I think that it's very easy in a way to sort of posit a kind of binary of, for instance, continental European reviewing. I'm not saying you were doing this at all. Sort of how wonderful it is that critics are able to be more expressive and freer and resistant to commercial pressures. They never have to. I can't imagine any theatre producer is going to put that on a marquee outside a theatre at any point. There can be a sort of an aesthetic distance and a sort of nobility to the profession almost. I suppose a bit of me, maybe it's because I'm a hack, is also in favour of the way in which, as in so many things, British theatre is a kind of mixed economy. It's a subsidised, expensively subsidised by some standards, by American standards, very expensively subsidised theatre economy. It's also deeply commercial. In the same way, newspaper reviewing can be incredibly highbrow and academic, and the books pages of any newspaper are kind of testament to that. At the same time, they're also shamelessly populist. The fact that I was writing a review in 45 minutes in a taxi wasn't just because of the evilness of my editors, it's because it was going to go into the news pages. A theatre event being performed by a visiting company from New Zealand, performing Shakespeare in a language that no one spoke, was regarded as newsworthy. And a bit of me thinks that's quite good. So I think there is a sort of interesting tension here between what we think of as reviewing, and in some ways, I suppose I would almost I would try and defend that kind of tradition of it as well, the way that reviewing can be more towards the entertainment end of the spectrum, because frankly it's for a broader readership. I think it's definitely you see it in France, particularly in the kind of culture pages, they're sort of segregated, they're ghettoised, they're not part of the general run of what a newspaper might be thinking about. And I think in Britain that happens to an extent, but it happens less. And the fact that for a show like Viva Forever, the dreadful Spice Girls musical, the fact that The Sun suddenly produced a review of that, the Sun newspaper, you think The Sun has a theatre critic? And of course they don't have a theatre critic, they actually have some sort of staff who's knocking around you quite fancy free tickets. But there was still a theatre review and it still went in The Sun. It's become very fashionable among certain aspects of the kind of bloggerati to hate on Quentin Letts, who reviews for the Daily Mail, as many will know, and indeed in many ways he's a deeply odious man. Whilst also being personally very charming. However, to defend him, at the same point, he's writing for the Mail and he's writing for that audience, and I would rather that the Daily Mail covered theatre than it didn't cover theatre. I mean, we might have disputes about how it does it and how he writes and everything else, but I disagree with most other critics I read. I mean, it's fine. I think it's important that Lex is there writing in the Mail. So, I think there are all sorts of interesting tensions around what reviewing is and who it's for, and I suppose in some ways I would defend the slightly hack end of it sometimes.
I would like to move discussion now to Shakespeare and globalization, because our discussion was meant to address also this aspect. I mean, global Shakespeare is a big business, and everybody is doing it. We as academics write a lot about Shakespeare, and we do we do have a different anxieties about writing, but I'm really interested whether globalization changes how we look and view Shakespeare, and is it sort of creeping into sort of your mainstream reviewing? Is it sort of the blogosphere and our own academic writing? There's loads of very good blogs run by Shakespearean scholars. How does it affect you at all? Or is there any interplay? I mean, we do use your reviews, we do refer to them in our own writing. I wonder whether there is a sort of a bridging the gap somehow because of the access and the sort of demand of materials on global Shakespeare currently available.
I'll give that question to Andrew.
Yeah.
Do you mean in terms of whether we as critics are engaging with a kind of broader sense of conversations? I think that's true. I mean, in the years I was at The Guardian, I constantly tried. I mean, the problem is that one of the problems is that the newspaper review, as it has become, because it sits in a newspaper and because newspapers, as we all know, are shrinking, has shrunk over the years. I mean, recently, not so recently, a couple of years ago, we did a sort of anniversary edition for Michael Billington because of his 40th anniversary on the paper. Incredible to think, slightly horrifying to think actually. And the fascinating thing, one of the fascinating things about going back to Michael's early writing is that actually a lot of it was quite different to what he writes now, but also it's just a lot longer. I mean, he's writing at 900,000 words as opposed to these days, the most The Guardian will give him is about 430 or so, and often the reviews, the kind of down-page reviews, are about 305 words. So as the newspaper has shrunk, reviews have shrunk, deadlines have got tighter, and I think there is a real crisis around arts journalism, around how to evolve this into a new form of writing and how to simultaneously produce the kind of writing that can work in a newspaper over a breakfast table. I don't know if anyone even has breakfast tables anymore. Yeah, exactly. Whether they read newspapers over them, but notionally at least, the idea of the newspaper over the breakfast table, that a piece of writing that can function in that context can also do all the other things that a review is now required to do. Be a consumer review that you can search on Google. Be something that you, as a theatre goer, compare different reviews afterwards. You know, you maybe want to see what some of the other critics have thought about it or whatever. So I think there's a real sort of pressure there around what the review should be and how long it should be, what kind of form it is. And I have to say, we never solved it at The Guardian. Because there was always the pressure of the newspaper, as in so many things in journalism, you've got to kind of get it out every day and it has to fill the page. And I think actually that's a sort of real, I would feel that's a real danger, as well as all of the other pressures that are kind of encroaching on critics of time, space and money, very importantly, how you support yourself as a critic. Actually the question of whether anyone has been able to find a way of writing about theatre for a mass audience that is doing it in a different sort of way. I mean, Exient is doing really interesting work online only, blogs have done really interesting work, but the fascinating thing I always thought about many blogs reviewing theatre was the way that they just consciously or unconsciously aped the conventions of the print review. Started using those dread words like of a generation, those awful cliches, the first thing you strike out and notice it, by the way, if you can. And the way that they sort of adopt the kind of modality of print reviewing. And I don't know, I mean, what your view on this, Mark, is and what you suggest in a way in your book about how to go forward. But I do think this is a real issue, how to move the review on from being a sort of static piece of text in a newspaper.
I think that's certainly true. There are certain things that writing a shorter piece of writing, as we probably all discovered, is often more difficult than writing a longer piece of writing, and that's because if you're trying to sum up something in 300 words, actually what you're doing is closing all these doors to say, well, I've got this idea, but really that'll take up 500 words, and so I'll just close that door and I'll go into this other direction. And so certainly if you were trying to take on academic ideas of Shakespeare or anybody's ideas about Shakespeare, then that, you have to express it in a very subtle sort of way. And I've got just a tangential remark, just to draw your attention to a fantastic book by Paul Prescott called Reviewing Shakespeare, which came out this year, which some of you are nodding. And one of the things that he talks about is, as well as a canonicity of Shakespeare, the Shakespeare canon, there's also a canonicity of reviewing. And so if you ask any theatre critic operating today who they were influenced by, many of them, for example, will say Kenneth Tynan. So you go back to Kenneth Tynan and you find him in his still school days writing to James Gate at the Sunday Times for advice and so on. And then you go to James Gate and you see him incapable of going to see a Shakespeare production without first reading Hazlitt and Hunt and the people from a previous generation. And then, Paul Prescott rather amusingly then points this out, you get these things as accepted facts. So one accepted fact, if you've inherited this tradition, is that Macbeth is an impossible production to perform, and only one person has ever done it right. And of course, this one person, I'm going to forget who it was, but one of the great actors of the 19th century. This sort of becomes like an established fact, passed down from generation to generation of critics who can't possibly have seen this production and have got no way of telling whether, we just saw fantastically that list of great Hamlets of their generation. It's a similar sort of thing. On whose basis are you saying this? And it's because of the sort of received wisdom of all these people who have gone before you. So I think it's a slightly tangential answer to your question, but I think all of us somehow absorb this cultural information, but we're not always too sure of our credibility or justification for saying it, perhaps.
I think I will ask the last question, just to go back to the main topic of our conference, and I will ask how to review a comedy. Is it in any way different? Do you find it is in any way a different art? And I'm always wondering about matching, or sort of, there's a language of performance and the language of analysis, and whether, for example, we chatted about this on Skype a few days ago, whether reviews of comedies should be funny.
In themselves. Well, coming back to what I was saying earlier about your challenge of writing theatre reviews, one of the emotions that we can have is laughter. And again, you can often see when people talk about laughter in reviews, it's often distance. One felt a smirk growing on one's face. That's a bad phrase. But there would be there's a sort of exposure by saying I found it very funny, because that makes you very human. That's the sort of what bit of your brain is it? The sort of ancient bit of your brain is the thing that laughs, and then you think about it later. So there's this, as there is in academic writing, that sort of challenge between the gut instinct and the intellectual instinct. Whether you write a review this is stand-up comedian, in the field of stand-up comedy, stand-up comedians sometimes complain that critics have just lifted their best jokes and stuck it into their review, because that's a sort of, that's an easy way to do it, and it gives you a flavour of some of the nature of the material. So you can't quite do that in theatre. I think it's, I don't know. Again, comparing stand-up comedy to theatre, when people talk about theatre being hilarious, I think they sometimes mean it was gently amusing, because when you've seen a very good stand-up comedian, you think, no, that's funny, I know that's funny. Though of course some theatre is very, very funny as well. So that's a question of getting, calibrating your scale correctly. I'm just throwing out random thoughts about coordinating a BS. I'll stop.
I don't know if there are any rules to writing. To reviewing comedy any more than there are rules to reviewing. Should a review of a comedy be funny? It's always with everything. It's a question of context, isn't it? That where are you writing for? Are you writing for the non-culture pages of a mass market newspaper? Are you writing for a specialised blog? Are you writing for the TLS? There are gags in the TLS, though again they probably kind of fall more into the gently amusing category rather than the laugh out loud category. So I think that's I would say it's more of a question of context, you know, where you're actually writing. And though I think I absolutely agree with Mark, I mean, there was an interesting thing. I mean, it's always very interesting doing teaching, I find. And I've done various sessions with sixth formers in the last few years about sort of writing for theatre, which, you know, part of you wants to say, why on earth do you want to write for theatre? Do you realise there's no career, no prospects, it's terribly hard and no one likes you, and you know, even if you're very successful, everyone hates you. And actually, but the thing that's very interesting, of course, is that writing reviews, which isn't, or writing, whether you use the word review, writing critically isn't something that certainly A-level students are encouraged to do very often. Actually, it's really sort of that thing I was talking about earlier, that kind of difficult nexus of trying to achieve loads of different things at once, be reportage and also subjective and also objective. Actually, that's a really interesting exercise to do with 17, 18-year-olds. And yeah, certainly I've found that, you know, working in those sorts of contexts makes you, aware of how difficult it is to do. But also how actually, yes, you need to let the emotion in as well. That it's very, very easy to be sort of readable and to let this kind of academic tradition kind of come over you. I'm doing a talk once with Benedict Nightingale in one of these sessions that used to be a reviewer for the Times, now retired, and I sort of gave a very sort of earnest thing about how, you know, being a critic is a bit like being a motor mechanic. I can't believe what I was thinking. But I was trying to kind of get the idea of actually where I was trying to get was the idea of taking something apart and putting it back together. Don't break it. You know, criticism shouldn't be destructive. You know, you're not trying to blow something up. You're trying to let it still function afterwards. And then Benedict sort of had this rather sort of ambiguous kind of smile as he came on later and said, yes, it's absolutely right, I totally agree, though you should also be able to let the car run over you at the same time. And I think that's true. So I don't know if it answers your question about how to write about comedy, but yeah, you have to allow that section of your brain into it as well, I think.
I've got a little bit of an addition. Didn't quite get to the point, which was that in all sorts of writing, you can choose to allow the form of the thing that you're reviewing to be embodied in the piece of writing that you're doing. So if it's very tragic, I mean, an obvious way, if it's very tragic, then you can write a more sober and serious sort of review. If it's very funny, short sentences, sorry at the back, quick remarks, something of the pace of the production is somehow echoed in the pace of your writing. And I think that it might feel appropriate to respond to a Shakespearean comedy in a light, breezy, who said fast-paced way before.
I think it's time for questions. I'm sure you have loads of questions for our two speakers. Let's open the floor. Stephen?
I have a question about your imagined reader. Do you have a reader in mind when you're writing, and does it change depending on what you're reviewing?
It's one of those questions and in my book I address it. The more you think about the potential readers that there could be and their motives for reading, more to the point, it really would be like going in front of Wembley Stadium or something and trying to please everybody at the same time. You could just freeze up thinking about it, because of course, as we've been hearing, there are academics who'll be reading your writing, or potentially reading your writing in 200 years' time. What do they want? Why are they interested in me? Even if I know that they're academics, what are they? I don't know what the motive is. There could be people who've seen the play and want to have a conversation about it. There could be people who are thinking about buying a ticket to a play, which is not really the thing I'm interested in terms of trying to persuade someone to go and see something, but that's certainly an element in that consumer report type thing. It could be somebody who lives 300 miles away, has got no intention of going but likes to keep up with the culture. It could be somebody who has just picked up the newspaper on the train and they've got nothing better to do for the next 2 hours, so they'll just read this stuff for entertainment. They don't know anything about theatre. So all of those things are possible. I sometimes feel, I work freelance and I sort of move from publication to publication, and people sometimes say, do I write differently for different publications? And you're sort of not conscious of it, but I think it's the equivalent of, for example, the way I'm addressing you now would be different to the way I would address my wife or my dad or my my daughter or a stranger in the street, or so you're still you, but somehow your voice changes in different circumstances. If you know that you're writing for, the Edinburgh Fringe is a good example. It's a market, and people are looking for the good things and looking for to know what's hot, what's not, and so on. And so there's in quite a good way a clear relationship between why you in a lot of publications in what you're doing and why the reader might be reading it. So that could be quite less ambiguous. If I'm writing for The Guardian, I cover Scottish theatre for The Guardian, why should somebody in London or Brighton or Plymouth be reading this review of a show in Glasgow? I kind of think that, well, surely then I should be talking more about the culture or what it means significantly within. So yes, the answer is it moves all the time, and it's a continual question that you have to ask.
I think my answer is yes. Well, we kind of know, but yes, you don't have an imagined reader, you have a reader who's an editor generally. If you're writing for a publication, they're a reader, they're a boss, they're going to kind of tell you whether or not you can work for them again. So yes, very specifically, and I think one's job as an editor is then to think about the readers more. So I think, if that system, which is highly endangered because of the economics of journalism, but if that system exists, I think that's sort of the way that I tend to do it. I don't think specifically, again, it's a little bit like, if you thought about it too much, you would kind of freeze because you would go mad. And actually, your job is to write. You should be writing for people, but you're writing for yourself as much as possible as well. And so these days, I think, now I guess I'm more experienced and feel more confident about it. I'm just actually, I write the thing I want to write, and then hopefully the editor likes it and they don't fuck around with it too much. But yeah, it's an interesting question. Of course, actually, one is also aware of the readers that one has because of comment threads. Absolutely, that someone has read it and disliked it or liked it or whatever. So yeah, I sort of, when I'm writing, the process of writing is generally so dreadful anyway that I have enough things to worry about.
Yes, Erin?
Oh, sorry. Thank you both very much. It was really interesting, and one of my main interests in this conference is about how Shakespeare in general is moving in all different ways, performance is moving online, or how the online goes between digital and non-digital and whatnot. And with audiences, sometimes those kinds of discussions in communities overlap, whether it's on blogs or with your own reviews, in comment pages and things like that. So this general question and a specific one. The general one is just inviting your reflections on that with, certainly like with The Guardian, it doesn't invite comments, but I sometimes wonder if how people feel about that, if whether or not you want those, and how you as a reviewer do or don't respond to that, because in some ways you're getting reviewed by the reader sometimes. And then specifically, and this could be an incorrect perception, but why is it that it seems to me that The Guardian discussions are so vociferous and at times vitriolic? And I know that crosses over different media outlets, but especially I notice it when I am looking at multiple reviews of the same production. And it could just be anecdotal, but I don't tend to notice as many comments on other, on the Financial Times and the Independent. I don't understand what's going on there. What is that community or those communities?
I wish I understood it as well. So the two questions. So one about So what was it you were saying? The general thing about?
Yeah, I guess the general thing is just about. I suspect that it depends on the person. Because some people might say. You may or may not agree with this, that in opening up a comment section, it's positioning the reviewer perhaps as the lead voice in a conversation that evolves, or a kind of facilitator, but I can also imagine in some cases not. Like maybe it doesn't change your form, you're still writing something that's going to get printed as well, and it's going out that way and you're going to leave it. So I'm just interested in how reflexive it is for you and whether or not it's a good thing or bad.
Well, I think generally, it's like I mentioned that critics moan about stars in those meetings. The second thing I moan about is comments, and having to deal with the comments and all these dreadful people kind of coming on and disagreeing with them and everything else. And in some ways that's yes. I think honestly, I don't really think there's a single answer to those kind of issues particularly around the Guardian, say. I think because definitely when I was there, we were thinking about it a lot because it was a big puzzle to us. And I think one thing is actually just a very basic technological thing, that the comments section was for so long just a kind of very straightforward, it was more like, kind of it's asking people to leave graffiti essentially. Then there was also the perception that the writers weren't kind of really engaging, so you can sort of slag off Hadley Freeman, and Hadley Freeman will never kind of be there. Hadley Freeman probably doesn't exist. Who's Hadley Freeman? I think also a sort of certain level of banked up sort of vitriol and hatred over about sort of 20 or 30 years sometimes. A real sense that people have not been able to say this stuff for a very long time, and now they finally get to take Michael Billington to task. I think that's definitely present sometimes. And I think, other sort of questions around who readership is, and also I think it's problematic when it comes to theatre, because generally speaking, the way that the process works is that if you're reviewing something after a first night, a press night, probably even if you're in a very large theatre, let's say you're a big West End theatre, maybe a maximum of, let's say, 5,000 people have ever seen that show, ever. And you're publishing a piece of content that people are then expecting, and somehow expecting people to engage with it. Like, what are they going to say? Like, I like Shakespeare, I like David Tennant, and I think that's a genuine tension of what kind of readership is that, and why would they want to engage, and why would they want to engage in this format? And also, I think the thing that you're hinting at as well, if it's, as it were, a sort of fixed, stable piece of text, which is also works in print, can it then also be the part of the start of a conversation, or is it the end of a conversation? I mean, certainly when I don't know what you feel, Mark, but when I've replied to kind of people who've commented beneath my reviews, a bit of me is like, well, yeah, fine, you have a different opinion. That's totally fine, you're absolutely entitled to it. I'm very pleased you do. I don't know how much we can talk about it really, because we saw the show on very different nights. There might have been something that happened that wasn't there the same night that I saw it. It's just very, very... So I think there's a whole set of different things going on.
It sort of comes back to that earlier question about who you're writing for, because suddenly you do see your readers in this sort of this discussion, and this is just anecdotal, but there was maybe my most recent review on The Guardian is of a show called Grit, the Martin Bennett story. And Martin Bennett, if people don't know, was a Scottish musician in the 1990s who combined traditional bagpipe and other Scottish folk musics with modern electronic beats. The sort of thing that when you're writing a review, you have to get your terminology right, so you sound hip enough to know what he's to know what you're describing. And I knew when I was writing this, because I gave it a 3-star sort of middling review, that many of the people reading it, or their motivation for reading it, would be because they were Martin Bennett fans. And indeed, at the end of the performance, everybody stands up and applauds because the show's quite touching, but I think also because they wanted to express their love of Martin Bennett. So if I, as the cool-headed critic coming in saying, well actually, those dance sequences were a bit rubbish, and what was this, that scene was a bit banal, what I'm challenging them on is their love of Martin Bennett. That's all they can hear is, I like Martin Bennett. And indeed, if you look at that, and so then somebody did come on the end of I wrote a very measured and informed and passionate article about why they love Martin Bennett, and therefore why I was wrong in suggesting that the play was less than perfect. But a bit like Andy says, that that's their opinion, that's my opinion, and there's only so far a conversation like that can go. So I did comment on their comments, and they didn't come back after that. But I have to say I'm slightly disappointed that so far the internet doesn't seem, in my experience, doesn't seem to have reached the potential that I think it has, which is that I think it's fantastic to open up the possibility for when I say, as a critic, I believe my job is to start the debate, not to end the debate. And the old school of criticism where, the grand critic pronounced and it went into the newspaper and that was the record and no more conversation would happen. That really doesn't interest me. So the idea of being the initiator of debate really does. However, the reality of it is that with some exceptions, and possibly it's for the reason Andy says that physically not enough people see any one production, so it's quite difficult to have an informed discussion beneath it. But it does seem to me that you might get 2, 3, 4 interesting and relevant comments on a review, but then somebody says, Nazi, and it sort of all goes and it gets very circular and goes off on a tangent, or then people that haven't read the thing properly, or they haven't read each other properly. And so it seems to me, this is a comment on the internet in general, but the tremendously democratic potential of the internet, I don't think has quite been marshalled in a way that would fulfil my belief that I'm starting a debate, because I might just be saying that in a sort of very vain way, that of course I'm starting a debate, but maybe I'm not, I don't know.
Yes, who's next? Hello, Martin.
Just want to make a comment. I worked for over 25 years as a theatre critic in a micro society in Iceland, writing in Icelandic, which was very difficult in all respects. But one of the reasons I was employed, apart from my background and education, was that I could be objective, as it were. That I didn't have ties, that I didn't have family, that those people didn't know me, etc., etc. Whereas what the standard was wonderful, 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 because nobody wanted to upset anybody. So, or it was terrible, 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 and that person was totally ostracised, and that's quite hard in a village. It's all right in this society that if you're the one person who hated it. So, but what I wanted to bring up was you've talked about trying to envisage a reader, which one probably doesn't, but the moral. I hate to say it, but the moral side of this is that you are providing not simply a valve or an interpretation, but a check to the possible abuses of the theatre. Because if it were, no, it's true, if you did not have this apparatus in place, it would say wonderful, 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 wonderful to everything it did, which is what it wants to do. So, and sometimes somebody's got to say, actually, wasn't that good?
I often think it's about TV, actually. That one of the issues around, the standard of kind of British domestic TV is that there is no good writing about it. I mean, there are some good TV writers, but there are not very many of them, because it's not regarded as serious in a way that film is regarded as serious. And I mean, the Viva Forever thing is a good rebuke to the idea that critics have that much influence. Though actually, of course, the show closed quite soon after that, because it truly was dreadful. And that rather wonderful reverse marketing exercise they did. They had a hashtag which was a sort of was it so bad it hurts or something? I can't remember. It was on the slide. Oh, what a shocker! That's right. Yeah, exactly. So it's so bad you'll love it. Somehow mystifying it. This didn't manage to fill 1,200 seats a night. And yeah, I think that's true. I mean, it's the old phrase, the parson's freehold, isn't it? The idea of sort of a degree of intellectual liberty. That I think if critics have any value, it is to be the one or the two or the 5 or the 10 people who aren't sleeping with the director or don't have a relationship with the designer or know no one in the cast and also know no one in the audience. I mean, I often find that theatre makers who don't like a review that you've done, weirdly they never say this when they do like your review, but they say, oh, well, the audience loved it. And it's like, actually I don't care that much whether the audience loved it, because I am me, and I'm not the audience. And I also never presume to be the audience. I'm not there to take a straw poll on what the audience thought. And I don't think that's my job. My job is as far as possible within the demands of this, and there are many demands and many limitations and many problems, but to try and have a scruple of intellectual freedom over that. And I think that newspapers, for all their foibles, and they are, believe me, endless, I think that's still just about perspective. That certainly as an editor, as editors, we would never go back to a critic and say, I think you should be more generous to this. You might say, this feels more like, your review feels more like a 4-star review than a 3-star review, which kind of grumble about the stars. Perhaps you might want to make the case more against it, given that you've given it a 4-star rating, or for instance, but those are questions of sort of tone and shape. They're not about what we think about it. So yeah, but it's a good reminder, I think, that for all that critics are dreadful people, at some level, the intellectual independence is really important, I think.
I agree with all that, and I would just, a little shade that I might put in though, is that, I guess I'm saying this because I observed myself, this is quite a long time ago, I observed in my own reviews, I found myself being much more harsh to shows that I live in Edinburgh, so shows that were coming to Edinburgh that were these sort of post-West End tours that would come and go in a week, and I found my writings seem to be ruder, basically, if I was writing about those, than if I was writing about an original production at the Traverse Theatre, for example. And I thought, well, is this just because I'm nervous about bumping into the actors and so on, and I'd be interested to talk to you about how it was after 25 years in Iceland, because presumably you did get to know the theatre community quite quickly, and they got to know you.
And then got not to know them quite quickly.
But the shade that I would like to introduce is the idea that actually all of us, when we experience theatre, we also experience it in the particular context and the culture that it happens in. And it's just true that theatre takes place in small places, in small rooms, and the meaning of something that has sprung from Iceland, if you're an Icelandic reviewer, that has sprung from Edinburgh, if you're an Edinburgh reviewer, it does mean something different to this anonymous thing that has just come and either entertains you or it doesn't. So I think it's slightly easier to, so if you are that completely objective, distant, unconnected critic, if such a thing exists, you're in danger of not tuning in to what it means to this group of people in this room now who are all interested in Shakespearean comedy. No other room might be interested in Shakespearean comedy, but this room right now is, and there is a context of that, there's a meaning of that, and if this was a show, then your appreciation of it would be related to that somehow. So I don't know if I've expressed that clearly enough, but that's sort of...
No, very well. And I think on this note, we'll finish now and thank our two guests.